All right, so a couple of housekeeping things. Number one, you guys are on mute, but you can hear me. Over the course of the webinar, I'm going to throw a lot of information at everybody. So please use the chat box, ask any questions, and hopefully Brian is going to be culling them because he's my engineer in the background, and we'll be able to answer them at the end of the webinar. Please type in what you're drinking. So hopefully we can have a list of what everyone's drinking at home for the end of the webinar, and then we can read it. What else? Speaker view. Make sure you're on speaker view clicked in the top right corner. Okay, so to get going, I'm just going to ask 3 people to tell us where they're from and what we're drinking, and then we're going to get into the meat of it. So why don't we go ahead and start with, oh, I got to put on my reading glasses. How embarrassing is that? Let's start with Mike Cope up in the corner. Hi, Mike. Brian's going to unmute you. Please tell us where you're from and what you're drinking.
Hey, how are you?
Hi,
everybody. Brian unmuted me. We're in Abilene, Texas. I work at Pepperdine, but there is not a lot of traveling back and forth right now, so we're sheltering in place in Abilene, and we're drinking your 2015 Gap's Crown tonight.
Awesome. I'm drinking the 2017, so cheers to that.
We have it as a backup here.
In case I go on too long and you need to open up a second bottle to take you through. All right, how about, is that, I think I see Annette down in the corner. Why don't we unmute Annette and you can tell us where you are and what you're drinking.
Yeah, hi Kerith and everybody. I'm in La Jolla, California, and I am also drinking the 2017 Gap's Crown, which we just got, I think, in a shipment, so yay.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Excellent, and one more. I think, is that Linda Wynn down in the corner?
Hello.
Hi, Linda, how are you? Tell us what you're drinking and where you're from.
Well, we're in Sanibel, Florida right now. We're hunkering in down here and staying safe. That's where we spend the winter anyway, so we're not going up to Kansas City yet. The wine that you have sent us, we're still letting it rest a little bit. So we have a bottle of the Selby Zinfandel.
Awesome. Go sip Sonoma County always. So yay for Selby.
Yeah, another female winemaker.
Yes, yes, indeed. All right, so here we go. So everybody, so prepare yourself to virtually travel to 3 different winemaking regions. Some people on here are new to Bruliam wine, so we're really just going to sort of start at the beginning. And tonight's presentation is really meant to be sort of a broad overview and not specific to any one wine, but just sort of an overview. So here we go. Let's see. Share screen. And here we go. Okay, everybody. So if you haven't already poured yourself a glass of wine, please go ahead and do so that you can sit back and relax and enjoy all the information that you're about to hear. So tonight's aim is to teach a little bit and to entertain a lot, and hopefully give you guys 40 or 45 minutes to sort of escape into your own mind and into wine country, even if it's just virtually. And some of you guys are new to Bruliam wines. So I'm just going to sort of start with an overview. When I was a little girl, my dad used to say to me, you can be whatever you want after medical school. And I held up my end of the deal. I did a residency and I did 2 fellowships. I passed my boards and thought, gosh, you know, I think I'd rather be a winemaker. So I went back to UC Davis. And I started Bruliam in time for the 2008 harvest, which is crazy to think that, you know, I'm going to be going on my, what is that, 12th or 13th harvest coming up. And it's been a long time, and I've loved every minute of the journey. But back then, it occurred to me when I was a medical student, since I love drinking wine, that maybe starting a winery might be a good way to legitimize my love affair with Pinot Noir. So you can see a picture of me over here back in the pathology lab in 2002, back when I was a resident in pathology. And then you can see a picture of me blending wine. And I guess all I can say about this is when they say blondes have more fun, they were not taking a career in winemaking into consideration at all. So pathology to enology is not such an inconceivable jump. Winemaking does rely a lot on science, and having a good knowledge of basic science helps a lot, because if there's a problem in the winery, you can head it off, because pretty much anything that can go wrong is organic chemistry secondary to microbiology. So on one side of the screen here, you can see a cross section of the grape. And I know you guys all remember 7th grade chemistry and the xylem and the phloem, but you're looking at a grape in cross section. And then on the other side of the screen, you can see a cross section of lung. It happens to show adenocarcinoma in the lung close to the inked margin of resection. But this is just a case in point that basic science is basic science. So I felt very, very prepared going into UC Davis, leaving medicine to study enology. I know this is review to most people, but I started Bruliam Wines 12 years ago with a single barrel of wine, 25 cases. And as you can imagine, if you are making the transition from medicine and having a well-paying job at an academic institution to making 25 cases of wine, it requires a lot of family support. So Bruliam is named for my kids, Bruno, Lily, Amelia. And of course, it sounds like cadmium or polonium. So the original logo is a riff on the periodic table of elements. And of course, a cheeky nod to the fact that I came from medicine before winemaking. And as you guys know, today I make about 1,200 cases a year. It covers multiple varietals. But again, today, we're just really going to deep dive into 3 Pinot Noir AVAs. So we're going to talk about the same grape, sometimes even the same clones, just growing in different neighborhoods, and the way that climate and region impact what you see in your glass, which to me is one of the most fun things about crafting Pinot Noir. So if you're drinking along with me, here's where I'm going to remind you to pick up your glass and take a sip. Now, for anyone out there who's drinking craft beer, go ahead and drink that too. If you're drinking Zin or Cabernet or Merlot or Sauvignon Blanc, take a sip of that too. And here we go. So Bruliam Wines really is a small family winery. And I'm always proud when my kids help out during harvest. And I will give you full disclosure, Amelia will only do punch downs on Sunday morning if I provide her with donuts. So I'm sure this slide is familiar to everyone. This is how you make wine. So on one hand, you know, winemaking is so simple that even Noah did it in the Bible. So after the floods receded, the first thing that Noah did was plant a vineyard. And of course, he was able to make wine very quickly, which is very different from my experience with my vineyard management company at Torrey Hill Vineyard. But he made wine and he proceeded to get totally drunk and naked in his tent. And I will tell you that harvest at Bruliam Wines is not nearly as exciting as that. So how do you make wine? Step number 1, obviously start with grapes. And again, here I'm going to remind you to swirl your glass and to sort of think about this miraculous transformation from grape to wine. Because yeah, it's scientific, but there's also something wonderfully magical about what I get to do. So step number 2, fermentation. So on one side of the screen, you can see me inoculating the Chardonnay, holding the pitcher. And on the other side, you can see the very, very high-tech way that I inoculate my big tanks. So there I am with a bucket. It looks just like the buckets that you get at the Home Depot. And I mix up the yeast in 5-gallon buckets and I climb the stairs and I dump it into the top. Step number 3, cap management. So I'm like, again, 7th, 8th grade chemistry. I know you guys all remember fermentation chemistry, and the sugar breaks down into alcohol, which is an exothermic reaction, which means it generates heat and it generates carbon dioxide. So what does the carbon dioxide do? It heaves all those skins and seeds to the top of the tank. But of course, we want the skins in contact with the juice, because that's where the flavor comes from and that's where the color comes from. And the way we get it back into contact is called cap management. And we can manage that with punch downs and with punch overs. I ferment in small woodies, like the 500-liter puncheon that you see on one side, and I ferment in big tanks, like big 5 to 6 ton tanks. But the basic technique is always the same. And depending on the arc of fermentation, sometimes I punch down once a day, sometimes it's 3 times a day. When you're fermenting in a small little woody, sometimes I use 100% whole cluster, which means that we don't destem the grapes. So it's exactly like you get the grapes from the grocery store on those stems. And it's really hard to break them down. And in fact, I'm not strong enough to use a punch down device and to get those grapes to start to break down at the start of fermentation. So what do? I rely on child labor, because child labor is free. So I put my son in there and he foot treads the clusters. Child labor is free. The snorkel is optional. All right, so once the wine has been fermented, we drain the tank. And here it comes. Oh, look at that. So fulfilling. So we drain the tank. And once the tank is drained, it goes right into barrels. And there we go. And after the wine is put into barrels, what's left are the skins and the seeds, which go into the press. So here's a picture of me. Again, very high-tech operation at Bruliam Wines. I'm using a PVC pipe rake to rake everything out by hand into a macro bin, which we're going to put into the press. And here I am at the press. And this happens to be one of my favorite hilarious pictures, because you can see all these little white pellets. Those are dry ice. So the idea is that the dry ice releases carbon dioxide. So I'm being reductive and protecting the wine. But of course, I'm outside and oxygen is all around, which is sort of points to the fact that sometimes voodoo trumps science. And if you're holding a glass of wine, let's drink to that, to the art of winemaking. Everything gets aged in oak barrels. And if you're really slick, you can rack barrels and drink your coffee simultaneously. And after the wine has aged for the appropriate amount of time, we rack it out of the barrels, and then you go ahead and bottle it. So if you're following along with me, pour yourself another glass of wine, pat yourself on the back because you made it from grapes to bottling. Since 2017, I've been lucky enough to make my wine at Grand Cru. It's a cooperative winery, and it's unique because we have hospitality, and it allows small wineries who don't ordinarily have tasting rooms to have access to the hospitality and the tasting rooms, which has been really great. We love visitors, and we hope that, go slide, go. And we hope that you will come visit me in Sonoma County once it's safe and once shelter in place has been lifted. Okay, so coming up is a minute-long video. It's not professional, it's not great, but it's sort of like a little virtual tour of the outdoor hospitality space. Here we go. Oh, the video's not going? Oh, it's not moving. Okay, so onwards and upwards. Sorry about the video, and time to get dirty. So, as I said, today we're going to talk about Pinot Noir that's grown in 3 unique regions, 3 unique AVAs, the Russian River Valley, the Petaluma Gap, and the Santa Lucia Highlands. Pinot Noir tastes like where it's grown, which to me, it's really important to tell you about the vineyards and the stories behind the vineyards, because that really impacts the personality of the wine in the glass. So maybe some of you have visited Sonoma County, maybe some of you haven't. And I just put this slide up for a minute to show how much of Sonoma County is actually dedicated to grape growing. And I'd forgive you if you thought that 100% of Sonoma County is planted to grapes, because Sonoma County is so synonymous with wine country. But this pie graph just sort of illustrates that much of Sonoma County is actually not planted to grapes at all. A lot of Sonoma County continues to be open, rural, beautiful land. And again, I hope you'll have the opportunity to visit me. So, let's see here. Oh, there we go. So AVA stands for American Viticultural Area, and it designates a portion of land that's bounded in a territory that's mandated by the federal government. And the idea is that grapes grown within this specific particular region share certain characteristics. And that might be the climate, that might be the fog, it can be the wind, it can be flavor, it can be texture, it can be acidity. But the idea is that this is helpful for consumers, because when you see that AVA listed on your bottle, it gives you a sense of context or what you might be able to expect from that wine. Here in the United States, the AVA guidelines are sort of equivalent to what you get in Europe. And I know that many of you out there, and I will not name names, have old world palates. So you'll be able to compare this concept of the AVA to the DO in Portugal, or the DOCG in Italy, or the AOC in France. The big difference here in the United States is that our AVAs only dictate the territory. It doesn't dictate the way we make wine, harvest wine, or age our wine the way the restrictive rules do in Europe. So what does that mean for you as a consumer? Grab whatever bottle you have in front of you and take a look at it. Do you see an AVA there? You might. So on one side, I have a label for the 2018 Gaps, which hasn't been released, but you can see it says Petaluma Gap. And on the other side, you see the Zinfandel label, which shows Rock Pile. And again, these are the AVAs. Sometimes a wine doesn't have an AVA at all, like the Rosé of Pinot Noir, which just says Sonoma County. Well, what does that even mean? It means it didn't conform to a guideline. So the guidelines in California are mandated for the entire state, and here they are. So if you want to list something as a specific AVA, the Russian River Valley, it means 85% of the grapes need to come from the Russian River Valley. The rules for single vineyard are even more stringent. 95% of the grapes in a bottle of Gaps Crown must come from the Gaps Crown vineyard. So here we go. Let's begin at Torrey Hill. As you all know, this is our estate vineyard located in the Russian River Valley. The name Torrey Hill pays homage to my roots in San Diego. Of course, the Torrey pine tree is native to San Diego County, and Brian and I went to high school together, and at our high school mascot was the mighty Torrey pine tree. So we thought it might be fun to name our vineyard in honor of where we grew up together. The Torrey Hill Pinot Noir is intentionally crafted to be a classic expression of the Russian River Valley. So if you're drinking a Pinot from the Russian River Valley or from any other AVA or whatever wine you have, pick it up, give it a smell, and start to think about the adjectives that come into your mind as you smell the wine. Do you get fruity notes like raspberry? Are they red fruit like cranberry? Is it deep fruit like plum? Are you getting savory notes, floral notes? If you're drinking a Pinot from the Russian River Valley, chances are adjectives like red fruit, red cherry, cherry candy, sarsaparilla, Dr. Pepper. Sometimes people say like cherry throat lozenger, like that kind of confectionery cherry, floral potpourri, warm baking spice. Those are the adjectives that come to the forefront. And as I'm making the Torrey Hill Pinot, I'm always thinking of those descriptors because I want my Torrey Hill Pinot to be a classic expression of the zip code where we live. So we bought our property in 2012. And when we bought the property, we were told the vines were planted in the 60s, which is pretty remarkable. So at our property, the vines are planted very wide apart. It's 7 by 8 spacing, which might not mean anything to you, except it's very old school. This is not modern farming. Number 2, the Pinot is bilateral cordons. Again, this is kind of technical winemaker speak, but it means, hopefully you can see my arm, it's where you have that long cordon with the single shoot positions. That's not how we farm Pinot anymore. Now Pinot is farmed with a technique called a guillot-cane, which is the sort of the pitchforks that come up that you see in vineyards. Number 3, we're planted to Martini clone. Pinot makers love to talk about clones and everybody else gets bored. But needless to say, the Martini clone is pretty old school. It's what they planted in carneros before you could actually sell California Pinot Noir as California Pinot Noir. It used to get called, it was box wine, and it was called California Bourgogne, or it was pushed into sparkling wine. So all of these factors led us to think, oh yeah, we probably do have old vines that were planted in the 60s. And if Torrey Hill were planted in the 60s, we would be the oldest continuously producing Pinot vineyard in Sonoma County. And we thought that was pretty awesome. So we immediately put that onto our website. 48 hours later, the phone rings. It's legal counsel at Hansel, kindly inviting us to remove the unsubstantiated claim from the website because Hansel is the oldest continuously producing vineyard in Sonoma County. So tonight, as we sip together, I can tell you that we are among the oldest continuously producing vines in Sonoma County. All right. So the Russian River Valley is pretty big. It's an ideal place for growing Pinot Noir. It's cool, it's foggy. It's divided into 5 neighborhoods, which some people like to talk about. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat box because Brian will be collecting them at the end. So the Torrey Hill Vineyard sits in the Eastern Hills neighborhood. Of the 5 neighborhoods, fog tends to be the least impactful in our neighborhood, although we still get morning fog. And we do get a lot of sun. So Torrey Hill tends to be an early ripening vineyard. It's the earliest ripening Pinot that I have of all the Pinots that I make. And down at the bottom of the slide, you can see historical data. And you can see in 2013 and in 2015, I started harvesting in August, which is a little bit crazy pants. Now, 2015 was a notoriously early vintage, the earliest vintage that I remember on record. But you can still see that Torrey Hill traditionally harvests at the very beginning of September, which is early. When we bought the property in 2012, we asked the kids, what does home ranch mean to you? And they came up with this drawing, which is charming and hilarious. So if you look at Dexter, our beloved pound dog, he looks like he's levitating above the vineyard. What you see there, those 2 brown lines, those aren't actually legs, those are the vineyard posts. So I said to Lily, Lily, why doesn't Dexter have any legs? She looks at me, Mom, he's sitting down, you can't see them. I'll also point out that I drive a blue Toyota Sienna minivan. I do not drive a blue lowrider pickup truck. But Bruno is clearly too embarrassed to put a Sienna on the label. And don't fret, we do live in a home that is architecturally sound according to the engineers, even though the label looks like we live in a tilted house. And of course, every year, as you know, the kids do a new label, and it always features our pound dog Dexter. And here's a sneak peek at the 2018 label that hasn't yet been released. All right, everybody, fasten your seatbelts as we zoom down into the Petaluma Gap, the second AVA. So the Petaluma Gap is the newest AVA in the United States, actually, I believe still. It got AVA status in December of 2017. And I have two vineyards in the Petaluma Gap, the Gap's Crown Vineyard and San Giacomo Vineyard Roberts Road, which makes this an AVA that's very dear to my heart. So here's getting a little bit granular, and it's showing the two vineyards. And Gap's Crown and let's see, San Giacomo are 24 and 26. Hopefully you guys can see my arrow. San Giacomo and the Gap's Crown Vineyard. So a lot of people ask me, why are there no vineyards out here? And you can see that I put in yellow, cows, no grapes. So the terroir in the Petaluma Gap is a byproduct of the topography. What do I mean by that? The Mayakama Mountains separate Napa from Sonoma. And what they do is they create a funnel that pulls the fog east, and then it pushes it out to San Pablo Bay. So we get fog in the morning and the wind in the afternoon, and this wind tunnel is created by the orientation of the mountains. And here you see a great little cartoon, which just illustrates what I told you. The tagline of the Petaluma Gap is wind to wine. And again, you get fog in the morning. It comes off of San Francisco Bay. That should be no surprise. The sun starts to come up and warms things up. You hit the peak of the day, the grapes see plenty of sunshine, and then 3, 4 o'clock, the wind starts to come through the gap. And what the wind does is number one, the wind dries up the fog. Number two, the wind keeps the grapes cool so they retain their acidity. Number three, the wind acts to thicken up the skins so that you're going to get a little bit more color and a little bit more texture out of a cool climate site. So I've been playing in the Gap's Crown Vineyard since, 2008, which makes it my oldest continuously producing vineyard partner that I have. And I'll point out that in 2012, the Gap's Crown Vineyard, I think it was 2012, was purchased by a guy named Bill Price. And I was pretty sure that after he bought the vineyard, I was going to lose my access to the fruit. So to put things in perspective, some of the big wineries you may have heard of, like Costa Brown or Patson Hall, they get between 70 and 120 tons per year off of that ranch. Bruliam wines, I'm lucky to get 3 tons a year. And I call my own picks, so I'm kind of a pain in the butt. And my magical minivan can't get to the top block because it's too steep, which means that leading up to harvest for 3 weeks, every 3 or 4 days when I visit the vineyard, I have to pester the vineyard crew to get me up to the top block in their 4-wheel drive pickup truck. And I bring the dog, so now I'm there and the smelly dog is there and we have to go to the top of the mountain. So needless to say, when Bill Price bought the Gap's Crown Vineyard, I was pretty sure I was on the chopping block. However, the vineyard guys went to Bill Price and the vineyard manager and they said, "You can't cut Cupcake Girl, she's our favorite winemaker," which takes us back in time to 2011. You guys probably know about the 2011 vintage. It was really cold and it was really late and we had quite a bit of rain. So being the type A control freak that I am, I was very much following the rain and specifically scheduled my Gap's Crown pick to happen at 2 or 3 in the morning before the rain was coming the next day. As many of you know, I have an anxious personality. So I started to get worried that it was going to rain on my fruit. So I called the vineyard manager and I begged him. I said, "Please, please, oh please, can you pick my 2.7 tons of Gap's Crown early?" And guess what he said? He laughed in my face. He said, "We have to expedite 42 tons for Patson Hall. We are not going to expedite your 2 tons. And on a whim, I said, "I'll make you cupcakes." And he paused And he thought about it. And he said, okay, no problem. Honestly, I had no idea it would be that easy. The phone rings at 1 a.m. We're getting ready to pick your block. The phone rings at 2:15. We've picked your block. The phone rings at 3:45. We're weighing your block. The phone rings at 5. We're on our way to the winery. And sure enough, despite being woken from sleep 5 times, they did pick my block early and it did not get any rain. And Brian and I actually opened a bottle of the 2011 last week and it was really, really delicious. Now, every year, I leave, let's see here. I leave cupcakes in the vineyard shed for the Gap's Crown crew because I am so grateful for all they've done to me.
There's an important question of what kind of cupcakes.
Oh, right. This is an important question that I will pause for. The cupcakes happened to be pumpkin cupcakes with cream cheese frosting, decorated with like a little candy corn guy on top. Now, I wish I could say it were my personal recipe. It happens to be the Martha Stewart pumpkin cupcake recipe, which is easily found online, and I just copied it. But yeah, they were pumpkin cupcakes because it was seasonal. Thank you for asking that very important and critical winemaking question. All right, so here's a beautiful picture of the Gap's Crown Vineyard. It was actually taken by Catherine McPhail, sister to James McPhail, whom you may know from McPhail Wines, and a longtime mentor of mine. But I love this beautiful picture because you can see the fog line in the back behind the tree. So if you're drinking a Pinot Noir from the Sonoma Coast or the Petaluma Gap, pick it up now and take a sniff and take a sip. Chances are you're going to taste a bright, zesty acidity that comes with Petaluma Gap fruit. And again, that's a byproduct of the fog and the wind that keeps everything cool. The wine's probably also going to have a nice palate weight, some good extraction, and a really nice texture. And again, that's a byproduct of the wind. The wind is thickening up those skins. So you're getting a little bit more of a full-bodied wine than you might expect for a cool climate site. And I believe this is just another picture of the fog. And this is showing the fog in the background above one of the Petaluma Gap vineyards. All right, let's see. So this is supposed to be a video. You guys may have seen it before, and I believe the videos aren't working, but it was supposed to show the fog coming in and out of the vineyard on time lapse. So now, again, please buckle your seatbelts, and we're going to follow the fog 4 hours south into the Santa Lucia Highlands, into the heart of Monterey County, and don't get car sick because it's a fast journey. Here we go. And ta-da, Santa Lucia Highlands. Here we are. So Santa Lucia Highlands sits over the ridge from Monterey Bay. It's a super teeny little region. To give you some context, we're sitting here in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath country, Cannery Row country. And again, this is our final AVA, Santa Lucia Highlands. And here's a beautiful picture of SLH. And if you've never heard of Santa Lucia Highlands, of course, I forgive you because it's really small. It's only about 18 miles long, 2 miles wide. And if you think back to the beginning, to that picture we saw of Sonoma County with all of the AVAs, to give you some context, Sonoma County is about scant 80 miles long, 65 miles wide. So SLH is just a teeny tiny strip. Everything is produced in really small quantities. But it's some of the most beautifully and most pristinely farmed Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So it's a place you really should know about. I love that Letty Teague in the Wall Street Journal calls this our favorite California wine region that no one knows about. When Antonio Galoni most recently did a review of SLH, he said for consumers, seeing SLH on the label is the best guarantee that you can find for domestic Pinot Noir and domestic Chardonnay. That's pretty high praise indeed. And this is another great time to grab your glass and to give it a swirl and take a sip and just think about the way that 3 different regions have an impact on the same grape just because it's grown in different climates. If you're drinking a Pinot Noir from Santa Lucia Highlands, you can bet that it's probably got lots of dark, brambly, wild fruit character and even some savory notes. So these are just some of the facts. Santa Lucia Highlands actually sits broadly within Monterey County. The late Nicky Hahn realized that this little protected area was so special and so unique for grape growing that he chunked it out as its own AVA in the 1970s. Here's another cartoon. It might look familiar and you're like, oh yeah, fog and wind. It sounds exactly like the Petaluma Gap. But here's the big difference. The big difference is that in SLH, the wind starts to rip through around 2 o'clock. Why is that important? Because you haven't hit the peak temperature of the day. So in the Petaluma Gap, the grapes warm up to the hottest part of the day and then cool down. In the Santa Lucia Highlands, you never reach that hot peak temperature, which is why that Randy Caprasso at the Psalm Journal, a reviewer likes to joke that grapes in the Santa Lucia Highlands spend more time wearing sweaters than bikinis. The other thing that he likes to joke about is the terroir. So Pinot Noirs from the Santa Lucia Highlands also have an earthy, savory edge. And I think some of that comes from the fact that all of the vineyards are surrounded by the beautiful native flora of California, which includes things like wild herbs and chaparral. So the Gary's vineyard sits next door, or the Sobranes vineyard sits next door to a vineyard called Gary's Vineyard. And Gary's Vineyard is perhaps one of the best known, or the first well-known vineyards in that neighborhood. And it's called Gary's S' because it's owned by 2 guys named Gary. And the original Gary Pizzoni, was said to have planted Pinot Noir grapes there on a lark. After his parents had a bumper crop of celery and they had some extra cash around, and he begged and pleaded and convinced them to let him grow Pinot Noir grapes. And it's also known as a suitcase clone. So again, talking about clones, but the fun story is that Gary Pizzoni claims that all of the cuttings from his vineyard were stolen from Domaine Romanée Conti, which is perhaps the best known Pinot Noir vineyard in the world. And that he was in France and he stole these cuttings in the night and he took them home and he stuffed them into his bags and he wrapped them in his underwear and he brought them through customs and used that to seed his entire ranch. I will tell you that I can neither confirm nor deny those allegations at this time, but the Sobranes vineyard is indeed planted to the proprietary Pizzoni clone. And if you're sipping wine at this time, and my glass is almost empty, this is a good time, especially if you're drinking a wine from SLH, to sort of contemplate how a wine opens over time. We've been sitting here together for 30 minutes maybe, and my wine, the 17 Gaps, has opened a lot in the glass. And again, that's one of the fun things about wine, is that it is something that's organic. It is something that's going to change over the course of your meal. I need to share the screen with you. And here we go. So this is just a really beautiful picture of the Sobranes vineyard that I love so much. The first commercial crop was in 2010, and I've been with the vineyard since that inaugural vintage, which means this year in 2020 will be my 10th year of working with the Sobranes vineyard, and the fruit just gets more glorious every year. And this is just another lovely picture that Mark took for me, Pizzoni took for me back in 2012 of Bud Break. And it's just such a pretty picture. And again, when we're talking about SLH, we're talking about dark brambly fruit, the brooding quality. I like to joke that The Sobranes vineyard is dark and brooding like Heathcliff on the moors and Wuthering Heights. And Gap's Crown is bright and cheery like Mr. Darcy and Pride and Prejudice. But I will note that it's Mr. Darcy in the second half of Pride and Prejudice. It's good Mr. Darcy, not jerk Mr. Darcy. And that's the end. So thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for being receptive to so much information in such a short amount of time. I'm going to go back into share mode, and hopefully Brian has some questions for me. All right, guys.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay. From the Gap's Crown, are your rows in the same place in the vineyard or in different places?
That's a great question. So I have two different blocks.
Repeat the question.
Let me repeat the question. Are the rows in the Gap's Crown vineyard in the same place or in different places? I have two blocks in the Gap's Crown vineyard, and they are located in different places among the 130-acre vineyard. I have one block at the very bottom of the vineyard, which is clone 777. It does not have any appreciable elevation at all. It's actually at the same elevation as the San Giacomo vineyard. So that part is going to have a lot of fog. It's going to be a little bit cooler and maintain the acidity. The second block is block 1C, and it's actually the highest block on the entire ranch. And that is the 115 clone. That tends to get a little bit riper because it's southwest facing and it sits above the fog line. Interestingly enough, it's low yielding because it gets decimated by the wild turkeys. Every year we put up bird nets, but the wild turkeys, they're pretty aggressive. So you can see when they get in there and gobble up one of your clusters. It's also a good sign. It means the grapes are sweet and you're getting close to harvest.
With regard to Santa Lucia Highlands, how do you actually get the grapes to the winery?
That's an awesome question. How do I get the grapes to the winery in Santa Lucia Highlands? Well, the good news is that Mark Pizzoni does the farming, and his brother Jeff Pizzoni is a winemaker for their family label, and Jeff's winery happens to be right in Santa Rosa, California. So once or twice during the growing season, I drive the 4 hours down to SLH to say hi to Mark, to walk through the rows with him, and to sample and see how fruit set is. For the rest of the time, Mark sends me samples along with vegetables. So leading up to harvest, every 4 days, Mark sends me a large gallon Ziploc bag chock full of clusters. And I'll smush up those clusters, I'll strain them, I'll taste the juice, and I'll test all the parameters that I want to test. In addition to having grapes, Mark usually sends up cucumbers, romaine lettuce, and cauliflower, which is always a pleasure. When we're ready to harvest, again, Mark picks really early in the morning and the fruit comes up on a giant refrigerated truck. Awesome question. Thank you.
The most important question of the evening comes from Carly, whose girls would like to know what your favorite color is.
Oh, okay. Hi, girls. That's a great question. My favorite color is pink. I especially like sparkly pink and anything with glitter, which explains why we have pink wax glitter tops on the rosé. Carly, if your twins are up, we can pan to them if Brian can find them and they can share their favorite color.
They're unmuted.
Yes.
Ah, they're unmuted. Hi, girls.
So Eloise, do you want to say your favorite color?
Pink.
And Eliza?
Red.
Awesome. Thanks, girls, for sharing your favorite color and for being so patient tonight. Well done.
What made you make the jump into white wine, the Chardonnay?
Oh, that's a great question. So, you know, one of my best girlfriends who's a winemaker had always told me, making Chardonnay is really fun. You should do it. You should do it. And I always joked, I'm not going to make any Chardonnay unless I can get Rocchioli, which of course is such a high bar that I sort of figured it would never happen. Of course, I was lucky enough to get access to the Heinz Vineyard, which is a cool climate vineyard with a ton of awesome Chardonnay personality. I personally love white Burgundy, and the Heinz Vineyard really lends itself to that California Montrachet style. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, of course, go hand in hand because they're growing together in Burgundy, so it was a natural transition for me. I have tried to convince the CFNO, Brian back there, to let me make a still Sauvignon Blanc. He has put the kibosh on it. I have tried to convince the CFNO back there to let me make a Marsanne-Roussanne blend, and here's what he said. If you really want to lose money, you should make a Marsanne. So I'm very happy to be making Chardonnay, and that's probably where we'll stay for the time being.
Let's see. Ed and Carrie wanted to get some information on how you got connected with the Pizzonis and the Sobranos fruit.
So
I'm going to unmute them so you can say hi.
I'm going to unmute them. Hi, guys. Hello.
Hey, how are
Hi,
you?
Ed and Carrie. You want to tell us where you're from for the people who don't know you?
We are in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And how's the weather in Wisconsin?
Not good.
April in
cold.
Wisconsin,
40.
71 day, 40 the next, and 50 consistently. So
All right. Well, we're going to be sending good weather vibes your way. That's a great question. So I'm going to deep dive a little bit more into that in a few weeks when we talk about SLH. But briefly, the first domestic Pinot Noir that really stole my heart happened to come from the Santa Lucia Highlands. And early on, and in my early winemaking days, I didn't exactly understand what it meant to have an allocated vineyard. I didn't realize that that meant that every row was already dedicated to a particular winemaker or a particular winery. So having more moxie than actual knowledge meant that I was sort of freed up to call all of these different vineyards and cold call them asking for fruit. And whereas some very well-known vineyards laughed me off the phone, I got super duper lucky with Mark Pizzoni. I called and said, hey, do you have any Gary's fruit? I've been making wine 2 years. I love Gary's. And instead of laughing me off the phone, he said, listen, we have this brand new vineyard. It's called Sobranos. No one's heard of it. It's brand new. The first crop's going to be 2010. So drive on down to the ranch and let's see if we get along. So I really got connected with Mark Pizzoni over a cold call. And it's been one of the most lovely and fulfilling relationships of my professional career at Bruliam.
I don't have any other questions you can ask. People will raise their hands or.
Any other questions, guys? This was a ton of information thrown at you guys in a short amount of time. And I promise that next time I'm going to rely on you guys to do the majority of the talking. So I'm going to remind you that next week is the interactive rosé all day party. I will spend about 5 minutes talking about rosé. And then for the rest of the time, we're going to throw it out to you guys. And hopefully you will share your stories with me, whether they're Bruliam stories or family dinner party stories or engagement stories or honeymoon stories. I want to hear from you guys about what made you fall in love with wine.
Mike Mayer has a question.
And Mike Mayer, question. Hi, Mike and Lisa.
Hey, I just wanted to know if you tried natural yeasts as opposed to some of the industrial ones.
Yep.
That's good.
So that's
Just
a great
let
question. Yeah, that's a good question. So as someone who is comes from a background in science and was UC Davis trained, it takes a lot of self-control for me to do a native fermentation. So we can, in the future, maybe we'll talk about yeast fermentation harvest parameters. But basically, if you're using a commercially produced yeast, you can rely on a complete fermentation without off odors. That said, in certain specific instances, I have done native fermentations, or I've pulled aside part of the fruit and done a native fermentation in a smaller vessel, like in the 500-liter puncheon, and then inoculated the big tank. Other times, I'll let the fermentation start native, and once I have a cap on the second day, I'll inoculate it to make sure that it completes fermentation. And then in number 3, sometimes in lieu of doing a native fermentation, I'll do a subsequent fermentation where I use a non-Saccharomyces yeast, which you would see in a native fermentation, followed by Saccharomyces yeast.
One last question.
Yes, last
Favorite
question.
wine, favorite vintage, any year stand out in your mind?
Oh gosh, I love all the wines that I make, but I've always had a soft spot for the 2014 San Giacomo Vineyard Pinot Noir. It was the first year where I got to play with that Torula spora yeast. I was one of the first people in California to start to play with it because I like to embrace things like that. So that was super cool. And I love the aromatics on it. They're so intoxicating and perfumey and spicy and woodsy, and I've always had a soft spot for that vintage. All right, you guys, have a wonderful, restful week. And I hope this virtual tour of California brought everybody a big smile that will carry you to Rosé next week, when I look forward to hearing from all of you. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.